Along with France, the UK is one of only two countries that's capable of presenting a nuclear deterrent against Russia. That deterrent, which is entirely submarine-based, may have been enough to force Russian President Vladimir Putin to hold back in the past. But now, Russia's nuclear threats are getting more serious. The UK has to respond. And it's doing just that, with the largest shake-up of its nuclear posture since the end of the Cold War. The UK has just announced that it wants nuclear-armed fighter jets from the US so it can do something terrifying to Russia. On May 31, the Sunday Times was among the first to report on the UK's plans. It says that the UK wants to buy a new fleet of fighter jets that are capable of launching nuclear weapons, giving the collective of nations its first air-launched nuclear option against Russia since the end of the Cold War. At this moment, the Times says, UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is in extremely sensitive talks with several parties involved in the decision, which would serve as a recognition that the entire world has entered a more dangerous nuclear era. Specifically, the Times says, the UK's head of the armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, and its Defence Secretary John Healey are looking for fighter jets capable of launching gravity bombs. These bombs, which offer lower power than conventional nukes, might be used in a first wave of attacks against Russia, followed up by the UK's submarine-launched conventional nuclear weapons, should a war with Russia reach the point of no return. Discussions with the Pentagon are believed to have taken place, with Starmer also having approved the UK's plan to buy more fighter jets. What jets does the UK want? As many American-made F-35A Lightning jets as it can get its hands on. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which says the UK will make this request as part of the Strategic Defence Review its Ministry of Defence, or MOD, will release to the public on June 2nd. In addition to the jets, this review will call for $8 billion to be spent on more ammunition, in addition to a plan to boost the Royal Navy's stock of frigates from 14 to 25. More details from the review will be examined a bit later. For now, the focus turns to the F-35A and why the UK wants it. The jet's basic stats, provided by the US Air Force, offer a good initial indication. The Air Force says that the F-35A is the US's fifth-generation fighter jet, and it was created as a replacement for its F-16s and A-10 Thunderbolt IIs. The jet is stealthy, fast, and most importantly to the UK, capable of carrying nuclear weapons that could be used against an enemy. An F-35A is a multi-role fighter, capable of generating 43,000 pounds of thrust. This thrust allows it to move at speeds of up to Mach 1.6, which equates to about 1,200 miles per hour, with the jet also having a range of around 1,350 miles with internal fuel sources alone. If the UK is able to throw aerial refueling into the mix, the F-35A's range is then only limited by the number of aerial tankers the UK can deploy. The jet has a maximum ceiling of 50,000 feet, which puts it out of the range of most of Russia's aerial defense systems, and it can carry a payload of up to 18,000 pounds. Army Recognition provides more details. It notes that one of the F-35A's biggest advantages is that it can be equipped with a huge array of weapons that can be cycled around based on a mission's parameters. Among them are the nuclear weapons the UK wants to be prepared to deploy, along with conventional air-to-air, air-to-ground, and precision-guided munitions. These weapons are usually carried internally, though the F-35A can be equipped with external weapon bays, which enhances the jet's stealth by minimizing its radar signature. Now, beyond this variable arsenal, all F-35As also come equipped with an M61A2 Vulcan cannon, along with 180 rounds. That cannon can rattle off rounds at a rate of up to 6,000 per minute, with pilots using the cannons for strafing runs and close-in combat. In terms of missiles, AMRAAMs, JDAMs, and several others can be launched by an F-35A. It's unknown if the UK intends to buy any of these missiles along with its F-35As, or if it will substitute its own. Frankly, it doesn't matter. What really matters to the UK, according to the Sunday Times, is that the F-35A can carry the B-61 thermonuclear gravity bomb. These bombs vary in yield from between 0.3 and 350 kilotons, with the UK appearing to want to carry these bombs rather than nuclear weapons it develops itself if it's able to get its hands on some F-35As. That'll be made possible thanks to NATO's nuclear sharing agreement, assuming the US agrees. It would also mean that the UK could start to present a nuclear threat with bombs that are up to 22.6 times more powerful than the little boy the US dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. Therein lies the point for the UK. It believes it needs to expand its nuclear posture because Russia has forced the world into a more dangerous nuclear situation than seen since the Cold War era. Just look at the threats Putin has made since he launched his Ukraine invasion in February 2022 to see the proof of that. In December 2024, the UK Parliament's House of Commons Library published a brief timeline of these threats, while noting that Putin has used Russia's nuclear power to threaten and cajole Ukraine and its allies for several years. Examples include Russia's March 2023 announcement that it was preparing to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. That country, which is one of Russia's few European allies and was used by Putin to stage part of his initial Ukraine invasion, represents a clear threat. It shares a border with Ukraine, meaning nuclear weapons deployed to Belarus could easily be launched at any key strategic site in Ukraine. The Belarusian deployment also marked the first time that Russia's nuclear weapons had been deployed to any other country since the end of the Soviet Union. A little over a year and a half later, Putin also changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for a Russian nuclear launch. According to the Arms Control Association, among the changes made was the inclusion of language that permits Russia to use nuclear weapons as a response to conventional weapon usage that Russia believes affects the country's sovereignty. Again, that was a clear threat to Ukraine and Europe. Putin's changes came just a few months after Ukraine counter-invaded Kursk and just days after former US President Joe Biden permitted Ukraine to use US-made long-range missiles inside Russian territory. The UK is also far from immune to Putin's nuclear rhetoric. In April, Yahoo reported on the leaking of a list of Putin's potential targets if Russia ever found itself at nuclear war with the UK. Those targets include a shipyard in Cumbria, a hull-based factory, and an unknown site close to the Scottish city of Edinburgh. All told, the leaked list contained 32 targets across the world, with other planned Russian nuclear touchdown points being in Romania, Turkey, Japan, Bulgaria, and even locations in the territory of Russia's allies such as Iran and China. Russian TV anchor Vladimir Solovyov, who's extremely pro-Kremlin and may serve as something of a rhetorical mouthpiece for Putin, also hasn't been shy about sending nuclear threats the UK's way. Throughout April, he was sending threats to UK troops to stay away from Russia, else they'll all die. In one episode of his news show, Solovyov also delivered this terrifying threat to the UK. "You don't understand the main thing. We see right through your coalition of peacemakers who are not peacemakers but are basically interventionists, will be destroyed. You have to realize that not only the frontline units you're planning to deploy on the territory of Ukraine will be destroyed, but since we can't perceive it in any other way other than the direct participation of your countries, you will feel the consequences, the likes of which you have never seen." Nuclear weapons weren't mentioned directly, but seeing as this is the same man who once proclaimed that one Sarmat means -1 Great Britain, it's pretty clear where Solovyov was going with his rambling threats. The point here is that Russia is trying to position itself as a severe nuclear threat to the UK and all of Europe. Deterrence is now on the UK's mind. So too is the restoration of the UK's air-based nuclear strength. During the Cold War era, the UK maintained several aerial platforms from which it could launch nuclear weapons. The Sunday Times says that these platforms included 50 Valiant aircraft, 70 Vulcans, and 39 Victors. However, the end of the Cold War brought about a widespread decommissioning program that saw the UK take practically all of these aircraft out of the skies. It instead switched to its Vanguard submarine program, which the Times says means that the UK is the only nuclear-capable nation that currently limits itself to a single launch platform. The US, by comparison, can launch from land, sea or air, with France maintaining aerial and naval nuclear threats. The UK Defence Journal highlights why this is a problem. With its claim that expanding to aerial platforms would offer more diversity to the UK, it also reveals the major problem the UK faces right now. What if its fleet of submarines can't do the job? A nuclear war with Russia might start with Russia systematically taking out the UK's submarines, or at least hindering them from completing their objective. The Sunday Times also highlights issues with this submarine-only approach. It notes that the UK can launch the kinds of lower-yield bombs it's now intending to fire from new F-35As. But that creates a problem. It's possible that neither Russia nor the UK's NATO allies will be able to distinguish between these low-yield warheads and the far more powerful conventional warheads the UK already has loaded into its submarines. That's a key issue. A low-yield gravity bomb would tip the world to the edge of nuclear war, but wouldn't necessarily push it over. However, a higher-yield conventional bomb would spark the world into a full-blown nuclear conflict. If Russia can't tell the difference between the two based on the UK's launch platform, an unlimited response might be possible. New F-35As mean that the UK is able to deliver more precise and, more importantly, limited strikes on Russia if the time comes to do so. Strangely, this creates a scenario in which low-yield nukes become a sort of negotiation tactic. They'll serve as warnings, likely with Russia replying in kind, that will still kill thousands of people, but provide enough room for warring nations to come to the negotiating table. It's a worrying prospect to think about. However, the UK now believes it has to give itself this option to maintain a strong enough deterrent against Putin. That's certainly the case for Simon Case, the former cabinet secretary, who the Times says views the expansion of the UK's nuclear deterrent as a priority. Speaking as part of a new podcast named The General and the Journalist, Case said,
"Deterrence depends on your adversary having some doubts in their mind, or rather them being certain that you can do real harm to them in the sort of ultimate case. In my view, you wouldn't rely on a single system for anything. That's true in many walks of life, let alone nuclear deterrence."
Case has a point. Since the end of the Cold War, the UK has hamstrung itself in terms of nuclear weapons delivery. So, the announcement that it plans to buy F-35As from the United States could be seen as an attempt to play catch-up along with reinforcing itself as a deterrent force. There are also other benefits to bringing in an aerial platform. According to the Council on Geostrategy, confining its nuclear deterrent to submarines places a massive burden on the UK's Royal Navy. Augmentation via other platforms is thus a necessity, the Council argues, both to increase the UK's credibility and to spread this burden across multiple arms of the country's military. Council on Geostrategy member Gabriel Eleftheriou builds on this, noting that the UK cancelled the development of its Tactical Air-to-Surface Missile, or TASM, in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. At the time, the MOD claimed that proceeding with the TASM would have been ridiculous given the new international climate created due to the end of the Soviet Union. Now, Eleftheriou says that approach can be viewed as remarkably short-sighted, as nobody in the UK seemed to believe it was possible for a return to the bad old days of an active Russian threat in Europe. Those bad old days have come roaring back. In response, the UK is being forced to completely recalculate its nuclear strategy. Of course, the obvious question is, will all of this be enough? The UK may be expanding in terms of the delivery vehicles it has available for launching a nuclear weapon at Russia. But that doesn't change the fact that Russia stands leagues ahead of the UK when it comes to sheer numbers. Plus, there seem to be no indications that the UK will start building more nuclear warheads even if it gets its hands on F-35As. The Arms Control Association highlights just how wide the disparity between the UK and Russia is. It says that as of January 2022, the UK has an estimated 225 nuclear warheads in its military stockpiles, all of which can be potentially assigned to delivery vehicles. In the UK's case, those vehicles are all submarines. By contrast, Russia, as of March 2024, has 4,380 nukes in its military stockpiles. It also has 1,549 warheads that are already strategically deployed, meaning they're installed onto ballistic missiles and in situ at various bomber bases. The UK doesn't have any of those types of warheads. All told, Russia's stockpile outweighs the UK's by nearly 25 to 1. Of course, the counterpoint to this is that the UK is also a NATO member, and under that membership, it currently benefits from being under the much larger nuclear umbrella provided by the US, which as of September 2023 has 3,748 nukes in its military stockpile and 1,419 that are strategically deployed. Throw France into the NATO mix, which as of January 2022 adds another 290 nuclear weapons to the NATO military stockpile, and you start to see some parity. However, the UK also has to think about the future. Right now, the US being a NATO member also means it's bound by the Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That amounts to an all-for-one and one-for-all clause. So, if Russia launched a nuclear weapon at the UK, the US would be duty-bound to respond as part of NATO's collective defence. The problem from the UK's perspective is that it can't be certain that the US will be a NATO member forever. As recently as March 2025, The Guardian was reporting on remarks made by US President Donald Trump that he may not be willing to protect America's NATO allies if he believes they aren't paying their way. It's common sense, right? Trump said when speaking from the Oval Office.
If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them.
The comments fed into the narrative that Trump may someday look for a way to pull the US out of NATO, which means the nuclear deterrent upon which the UK has relied for so long would disappear. Buying more F-35As now may be the UK's way of preparing for a future without the umbrella provided by the US nuclear arsenal. However, the UK could also have an ulterior motive. Mentioned earlier was the Strategic Defence Review, or SDR, under which the UK intends to announce its goal to purchase more F-35As. That review is part of the UK's plan to spend at least 3% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on defence by 2034. Here, a link to Trump's comment is evident. The US president's issue in NATO spending is that many of the organisation's members don't hit the 2% of GDP on defence target NATO set. Even as recently as July 2024, the Atlantic Council reported that only 23 of NATO's 32 members are hitting this target, and the number was much lower before Putin invaded Ukraine. So, the SDR could be viewed as a way for the UK to show that it's serious about spending big to deter Putin. Buying F-35As could also serve the dual purpose of giving the UK a second delivery vehicle for its nuclear arsenal, while showing Trump that it's willing to spend with the US to get to where Trump wants the country to be. The UK is essentially sweetening the alliance it has with the US by expanding its own nuclear presence, while giving Trump every reason to keep the UK under America's nuclear umbrella. If that's the case, this is a very clever plan by the UK. But even taking that out of the equation, the SDR proves that the UK is pushing to prepare itself as much as possible for a future where Putin expands his scope beyond Ukraine. In addition to F-35As, the 130-page SDR will call for the UK to achieve warfighting readiness, says The Guardian. That readiness will include the previously mentioned investments into ammunition stockpiles, along with measures to ensure the UK tackles a 15-year recruitment problem to rebuild its standing army from 70,860 to the government's target of 73,000. Other requests likely to be made in the SDR, according to The Guardian, include a new commitment to building 12 nuclear-powered submarines, the first of which will launch in 2030 and replace the older Astute class. Around $20 billion will be dedicated to modernising how the UK produces nuclear weapons, which may link directly to the F-35A purchases while supporting 9,000 jobs. The UK is also considering forming a new home guard to protect the nation's airports and communications nodes from hybrid warfare assaults. The Sunday Times adds to this SDR speculation, noting that the UK is planning to create a new underwater surveillance program dubbed Atlantic Bastion to guard against Russian sabotage of undersea cables and energy pipelines. New defensive shields are to be built around the UK to guard against ballistic missiles. Plus, the country will invest over $1.3 billion on what it's calling a kill web, which amounts to building an army of hackers and infrastructure that enable the UK to take the cyber war to Russia. Make no mistake about it, every aspect of the SDR is designed to make Putin realise that picking a fight with the UK is a bad idea. The F-35As are just the start. With everything else that the UK is expected to officially announce on June 2nd, the message being sent to Putin is clear. Russia is dangerous, and now the UK is preparing to be as much of a danger to Russia in every aspect of warfare. Now, let us know your thoughts about the UK buying new F-35As in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest military developments in Europe. And if you want to learn more about how the UK is preparing for a fight with Russia, check out this video on the secret weapon the UK is preparing to cripple Russia forever.